So get this. Today, we're diving headfirst into, like, the ultimate leadership showdown. We're talking Star Trek, people.
And you've given us a pretty unique angle to explore this with. A German podcast, huh? Was würde Captain Picard tun? Analyzing Kirk and Picard through a leadership lens.
Right. It's the age-old debate, bold and decisive like Kirk, or more calculated like Picard. I'm really curious to see what these German podcasters picked up on. Where do we even begin with this?
Yeah, it's interesting. They don't exactly treat it as like a straight-up competition. What they do is they really dig into what makes each captain effective. And it turns out they have very different strengths. A big point they make about Kirk is how charismatic he is. Like, his crew, they really connect with him.
It's that genuine, like, warmth, right? You totally buy that he'd do anything for his crew. The podcasters definitely caught on to that.
Definitely. They even say that this genuineness, this leading from the heart, is a big part of why he's such a strong leader. It's not just about barking orders. He really cares about his crew, even if it means bending the rules sometimes.
Which, let's be real, Kirk does a lot. He's always ready to risk everything for his crew, even if it gets him in trouble with Starfleet. Makes you think, how do we define what makes a leader successful? Is it always following the rules or getting the best outcome, even if you got to bend the rules a bit?
And the podcast really gets into that. They talk about this episode where Kirk has to decide between sticking to a crucial scientific mission or helping out with a medical emergency. He chooses his crew, obviously, even though it can put the mission in jeopardy. It's a perfect example of how his leadership style plays out.
Okay, I'm hooked, but we gotta talk Picard, right?
Yeah.
How'd they portray his leadership in all of this?
So, very different from Kirk's more gut instinct approach. They see Picard as the ultimate strategist. Sharp as a tack, always thinking ahead, very calculated, doesn't just jump into action without weighing all the options first.
More like analyzing sensor readings than shooting from the hip? Huh. I can see that appealing to a certain type of leader. But do they think that's, like, the better approach?
That's the thing. They don't say one is better than the other. They talk about how Picard's methodical nature can backfire sometimes. Like, all that thinking can make you miss opportunities. They even point out scenes where Picard's by-the-book approach slows everything down or just makes things more complicated.
So it's like a double-edged sword, right? Picard's thoughtfulness probably prevents a lot of rash decisions, but then there are those times when you need Kirk's quick thinking. I bet this contrast is even more obvious when you look at how they interact with their crews, right?
Spot on. The podcast gets into that. They talk about how Kirk's personal leadership, while great for loyalty, might sometimes lack the structure and delegation that Picard's good at.
I'm really interested to hear more about that. What kind of examples did they bring up to show those differences in action?
So a big theme for them is how Kirk relies on his gut and how well he knows his crew. He's not afraid to bend the rules, even give unusual orders if he thinks it'll get the best result.
Knowing Kirk, those orders probably involve some crazy stunts, am I right? But I can see how that would create a different dynamic than, say, Picard calling a staff meeting.
Exactly. And the podcast picks up on that. They break down these scenes where Picard's having those strategy sessions, emphasizing how he values everyone's input, even if he doesn't always agree.
That's interesting. It's like they're both trying to create this environment of trust and unity, each in their own way. Kirk does it by connecting with his crew personally, always there for them. Picard does it by promoting open communication, valuing what everyone brings to the table. Makes you wonder how those styles play out when things get really intense, you know?
And that's exactly where they go next. They analyze specific episodes, same challenges for both captains, and they look at how those contrasting styles lead to different outcomes. Ready to beam into some of those examples.
Totally. Let's see how those leadership styles hold up when the pressure's on.
Okay, so you know how we were talking about Kirk being like a risk taker and Picard being more careful? Well, the podcast, they compare this classic Kirk situation. He's dealing with his Commodore, right? Super volatile, wants to pick a fight with the Romulans.
Ooh, classic Kirk versus authority, right. What happens there? How does he handle a superior officer who's, not exactly known for keeping things cool?
So instead of like going head-to-head with him, which is SO, not Picard, by the way, Kirk uses this mix of charm, persuasion, a little, maybe careful maneuvering to try and steer clear of a full-blown incident.
He's playing 3D chess, but with personalities instead of chess pieces, and a potential interstellar war hanging in the balance.
Right. That's a great way to put it. And this is where they bring in Picard. They compare this Kirk episode with one from TNG, Picard's butting heads, with a Starfleet admiral about this new technology. Picard's got some serious doubts.
That sounds like Picard's wheelhouse, debating the pros and cons of new tech.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they highlight that in the podcast. They point out how Picard, even when he disagrees with someone higher up, he keeps it respectful, follows the chain of command, he speaks his mind, but does it by the book.
So two completely different ways of handling authority figures. It makes me wonder how those leadership styles affect their crews, morale and all that.
The podcast gets into that too. They say that Kirk's personal style, while great for loyalty, it can also mean his crew might feel pressured to go along with risky plans or not speak up if they have doubts.
Yeah, that fine line between inspiring your team and accidentally creating an environment where people are afraid to question things.
Exactly. And they contrast that with Picard. They say that because he's all about open communication, even when there's disagreement, it makes his crew feel like they can actually contribute,
Yeah.
their expertise, their opinions.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between making the tough calls and working together, leading confidently, but also being open to what other people think. This is giving me a lot to think about.
That's what's so great about was Würde Captain Picard tun. They use these fictional situations to get you thinking about leadership in the real world. It makes you ask yourself, what are my instincts? How would I handle those tricky situations with authority, risk, decision-making?
This has been a fascinating look at these iconic captains. Does the podcast come right out and say who's the better leader, though?
You'll have to hold tight for the thrilling conclusion, my friend, because that's where we're beaming you back up next time. We'll see if they declare a winner in the Kirk versus Picard leadership showdown. And of course, we wouldn't leave you hanging without building our own Star Trek leadership dream team.
All right, back for the final word on Kirk versus Picard. So who's the winner? Did our German podcast pick a side?
You know what? They totally dodged that. The podcast, they're all about, there's no one right way to be a leader. It's not about picking a side. It's about seeing the good and the bad in both their styles.
So less about crowning a champion, more about understanding like the whole spectrum of leadership,
Yeah.
right? Makes sense, actually. Different situations need different approaches.
Exactly. And they end with this cool thought experiment. They're like, if you could build your ideal leadership team, Star Trek style, who would you pick and why?
Ooh, that's fun. It's like fantasy football, but for leaders. So who's on your dream team?
It's hard to resist the classic combo,
Yeah.
right? Kirk and Picard. Imagine it. Kirk's gut instincts, Picard's strategy and diplomacy, all in one team.
Now that's a powerhouse. Kirk could be leading the away missions, Picard's on the bridge, handling the big picture stuff, treaties, alliances.
Exactly. But even a powerhouse team, they need support. Pure logic. Got to have Spock as an advisor.
Of course. Spock, always the voice of reason, keeping everyone's emotions in check, thinking about the long game. Plus, he could read people like a book. So helpful in those tense negotiations.
For sure. And don't forget Data, that brain of his. Analyzing data, running simulations, spotting problems before they happen, he'd be invaluable.
Data would be incredible, like having a supercomputer on your team.
Exactly. And can't forget about keeping everyone healthy, right? Dr. McCoy, he might be grumpy, but that guy knows his stuff.
McCoy would be great. A dose of pragmatism, reminding everyone to trust their gut sometimes, not just the data. Love it.
Right. And I know it's a bit unorthodox, but I'd bring in Janeway too. She knows how to handle the unknown, and she's got this unwavering dedication to her crew. Important qualities.
Now that is a dream team. With all those skills and experiences, they could handle anything.
And that's the main thing we can take away from all this. Being a good leader isn't about fitting into some box. It's about knowing your strengths, learning from others, building a team that covers all the bases.
So where do we go from here? Well, whether you're more of a Kirk or a Picard, it's about knowing yourself. What are your tendencies? How can you create a leadership style that's authentic to you, but also flexible enough to handle whatever comes your way? It's about embracing those challenges, just like exploring a new frontier, right?
Exactly. As Captain Picard would say, make it so.
Live long and prosper.